Thank you for coming again. Last week we sort of laid the groundwork, and although I'm not sure if this fits in. Somebody that I study with regularly made the point this week to me that one of the ways I approach things is I don't actually care about how you get there. I care more about the end result. And I thought one of the things, we talk about anti-Semitism, people come out to understand why the Jews. I thought one of the things I might do is something that came out this week. I want to talk about for a moment briefly about the products of anti-Semitism. Okay, about the products of anti-Semitism. At least, we can understand that when people kill, when millions of Jews die and millions of Jews suffer throughout history, and there's physical persecution, we can understand when there's discrimination, when Jews are put into economic disadvantage, forced to live in ghettos. We can understand, we can relate to that, okay? But there's sometimes it's harder to relate to what anti-Semitism does to us in a world where those are not issues. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in a letter on the scroll, says that the Jews have evolved from a people who saw their primary identity as a people beloved by God to a people persecuted by Gentiles. We've evolved from that. And now, living in America, or living in a free country like Canada, Europe's might be a little different. This came out last week in response to the rabbi has spoken on Shabbos about the Pew Report, which is a snapshot of the Jewish community as it exists presently. Whether the numbers are wholly accurate, partly accurate, is irrelevant. I remember in 1995 when the last survey was done, and it concluded that 56% of American Jews intermarried. There was a whole outcry in Boston that it's not 56%, it's 49%. Right? I mean, this is like real triumphalism. So when this came out in response to the Pew Report, I thought I just would like to share this with you, because anti-Semitism not only has obvious impacts, it has insidious impacts also that sometimes take over centuries and centuries. Guilt makes secular Jewish parents want them quiet about. Okay. On Tuesday, the Pew Research Center released the first major survey of American Jews in more than a decade. The result confirmed what most of us would have guessed. Increasing numbers of Jews are not religious, are married to non-Jews, and are raising their children outside the faith. Pew frantic emails from Boca Raton and Palm Springs. Jewish Daily Forward editor Jane Eisner told the New York Times the survey should serve as a wake-up call for all of us as Jews to think about what kind of community we're going to be able to sustain if we have so much assimilation. And in commentary, Jonathan Tobin wrote that instead of accepting assimilation, Jewish groups must resist it everywhere. He says, I am the problem. Take a look at his name, Gabriel Roth. It doesn't get better, okay? I imagine that 75 years ago, he would have changed his name to, I don't know what the equivalent to Roth is, okay? Schwartz became black. I don't know what Roth would have become. I'll leave that to your imagination. I'm the problem. 6 months ago, I told a friendly Pew pollster that I consider myself Jewish but not religious, that my wife is not Jewish, my daughter is being raised partially Jewish, in Pew's terms. And as an intermarried Jewish non-believer, I think it's time we anxious Jews stop warning and learn to love our assimilated condition. Learn to love our assimilated condition, even if it means that our children call themselves half Jewish and our children don't consider themselves Jewish at all. I think when you take a pounding over centuries, and when people challenge your legitimacy over eons, that those that are not knowledgeable, that those that are not strong in their commitment eventually get fed up and begin to wonder what the point of it all is, especially if they don't understand why why being Jewish has any particular significance other than as an ethnic group. if you go to the last page, I don't want to read the whole article. The second paragraph. The loss of Jewishness as a meaningful identity in America is the kind of loss that occurs when individuals are free to engage in the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so if you're free to pursue happiness, it's axiomatic that you'll stop being Jewish, according to him. It's the loss of something that has great meaning to many people and an important place in history, but that is essentially tribal. It's primitive. Tribalism is primitive. Tribalism is that we matter as a group. As she grows up in her kind of Jewish family, I hope my daughter learns to love reading and learning and talking and arguing. I hope she learns to take humor seriously. This is his definition of what's important in Judaism. In fact, there was a letter in the National Post about this, which quoted this, but she'll learn those things from my wife just as much as from me. The most passionate anti-assimilationists sometimes say that Jews like me are doing what Hitler couldn't, putting an end to Jewish culture once and for all. In fact, the disillusion of Jewishness into the mainstream is Hitler's worst nightmare. Today's American Jews have a great shot at leading fulfilling life as any people in human history. The fruits of Jewish culture are the gifts of Jews to the world freely given. Over the next century, American Jewish culture may come to an end, not in tragedy, but in triumph.
Grapes of what?
Okay?
The grapes of what?
All right? This, I maintain, is a product of anti-Semitism. Right? When you begin to question your worth as a human being, and you begin to find reasons no longer to maintain that identity. So, since the topic is Jew hatred, why the Jews? What I'd like to do tonight is I'd like to define our subject. And historically speaking, there are anywhere from 2 to 4 different strands in historical anti-Semitism. The first one is what Dennis Prager and other conventional historians would call ancient anti-Semitism. This is pre-Christian. This goes back to the days of Egypt, the Torah. In fact, I know that Lavan is often identified as the first anti-Semite. We say in the Haggadah, Rami Oved Avi, that an Aramite wanted to, destroy our ancestor Jacob. I'm looking for, listen, the reality is that Jacob did something to him. He ripped off Jacob. Jacob ripped him off. And, you can say that there's a rational reason why Lavan is not a fan of Jacob. An essay which I'll share with you in the next couple of weeks from a Rosh Yeshiva at the Keren B'Yavne, the yeshiva in Yavne, raised a very good point. We say Esav sones Yaakov, but Esav actually had a legitimate reason to hate Yaakov. You can argue, and many people wonder, and the rabbis discuss this, and the commentaries deal with this, is that what was fundamentally unethical of Yaakov to rip off Esav when he came hungry, and so you can say that was coercive because the guy was starving. In Canadian law or Ontario law, we have a certain amount of time to rethink a contract and to invoke all kinds of reasons why we shouldn't be committed to that contract. And also, he took the brachas from him. I can give a perfectly stellar defense of why Yaakov did it, and I can give you a very good insight into the fact that even though he did it, he did it something that may have been wrong, but still it had to be done. Sometimes you have to do things even though they're wrong, okay? Because in Jewish ethics, the issue is always what is the best action, not what is the totally pure correct action. In most cases, you don't have that option. Shabbat, when somebody is ill, and the rule is that he's permitted to go to, one's permitted to drive to the hospital. Okay, that's not the ideal situation. But however, in that situation, it's the ideal situation. So I can give a defense of Yaakov, but my argument is that it's fundamentally justifiable, or at least it's rational. Since the topic is the non-rational rage, I think I would like to point out what I think is the first instance in the Torah of non-rational anti-Semitism, or non-rational Jew hatred. And that takes place at the beginning of Parshas Shemot, when Paro gathers his people and he says, Havan is Chachma, let's get wise, and let's deal with the Jews, lest they rise up from the land, lest they join our enemies and rise up from the land. Well, if Pharaoh's afraid that the Jews are going to join with the enemies, possibly a group called the Hyksos, then if I was Pharaoh, the first thing I would want is to get the Jews out of the land. No? They're in the land, they represent the fifth column. Out of the land, it's not a problem anymore. Okay? Ibn Ezra translates Pen Yala Minaretz, lest they rise from the land, in a way, and remember, Ibn Ezra was writing in the 10th century, and he translates it in a very, very, very modern way, very contemporary. Pen Yala Minaretz, lest they'll rise from the land and take over. Right? Paro is afraid that the Jews are going to take over. Did the Jews evince any evidence that they were going to take over? Was there any notion that the Jews were planning to take over? Absolutely none. But as some of you may be familiar with, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which were published as an anti-Semitic document in the 1890s, which actually was based on a play that was presented in the 1840s in France. But I think the play was meant to be satirical. The Protocols of the Elder Zion was designed by the Tsar Nicholas II's secret police, and to get people to be afraid of Jews. And the Protocols of the Elder Zion claims that the Jewish elders meet internationally. They have a secret meeting every year. And in that year, they develop their plans for how they're going to take over the world, including putting bombs under London, and in general, there's no way. It's totally fantasy. Right? And as Dennis Prager pointed out last week, as we read, the Jews have been objects of hate in pagan, religious, and secular societies. Fascists call them communists, communism calls them capitalists. What is it? Okay, these are total opposites. They're total opposites. If you try to join society, you're pushy. If you try to be separate from society, then you're not trying to be joined. You're an outsider. You're rejecting their values. Whatever you do, you can't win. Okay? You can't win. It makes no sense whatsoever. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, and I'll repeat this again in another context. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, the charge that the Jews killed God. Think about it. Can humans kill a God? It's not rational. It's not rational, and yet millions and millions and millions of people believed it for thousands of years, and I'm sure that they still exist. It's not rooted in reason. Right? Later on, the idea comes out that the Jews are the devil. Okay? Because the only reason they could reject Jesus if they weren't human. Every human would willingly embrace Jesus. Okay? And Bernard Lewis argues that this notion of ancient anti-Semitism, pre-Christian, pre-Islamic anti-Semitism, which is based on the fact that the Jews were different. They ate kosher, they lived separately, they had different kinds of lifestyles, that the hatred of the Jews was based on cultural difference. Bernard Lewis, who's a great historian of the Arab world, and I certainly can't, not qualified to criticize his overall historical work, but Bernard Lewis argues that there's really no such thing as ancient anti-Semitism. He says if you look at the ancient world, every group despised every other ethnic group. He says there are Etruscan jokes, there are Gepoid jokes, just like there are Jewish jokes and Polish jokes today. Okay, so in those days they had other jokes based on ethnic identities. We know that the Greeks, that in Athens one could not become a citizen of the city unless one was born there. Okay, so we know that there was discrimination for people that weren't locals, And Bernard Lewis argues that there's no such thing as ancient anti-Semitism. Bernard Lewis argues, in fact, Bernard Lewis dismisses the whole notion, as is classically going to be laid out by me, that this notion doesn't exist. He says anti-Semitism exists when you attribute supernatural powers to the Jews. Okay? So what's a supernatural power? I think taking over the world, okay, by such a small community is a supernatural notion. All right? But going back to our theme, so ancient anti-Semitism involves the notion that that the Jews were different, and by and large, with the exception of the Greeks, the Jews got along fairly well with their neighbors. We find very rare instances, for example, during the Babylonian exile, after Nebuchadnezzar conquered the Jews and they exiled them to Babylon, we don't really find mistreatment. I've always wondered exactly why Nebuchadnezzar is portrayed in such evil terms. He allows the Jews to come, they establish businesses, they farm, they do whatever they want, he leaves them alone to practice their religion. So, and the Persians come along, the Persians virtually never persecute the Jews. They go ahead and, in fact, Cyrus, the Persian emperor, invites the Jews to go back to Eretz Yisrael. He invites all the people that are conquered by the Babylonians to return to their homelands, serve their gods. This notion, in a polytheistic society, the notion that there's 1,000 gods is not threatened by the notion that there might be 1,001 gods. Right? So really there are no religious wars. This is one of the canards of secular liberalism or liberalism, that religion is the cause of war, because long before religion became the cause of war, there were wars. In fact, David Nirenberg, the author of this book, which we'll be talking about a little bit, probably next week, is a professor at the University of Chicago. The book is called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. I've read the introduction 3 times because I'm still not sure I understand it. I usually give up, but because I like the theme, I'm going to pursue it. I'm going to try to pursue it. David Nirenberg quotes somebody, and I never thought of it, that the first religious war was Hanukkah. In fact, the first religious war in history was Hanukkah. So really, it wasn't even the Greeks, okay? It wasn't even the Greeks. It was Jews. It was Hellenistic Jews. It was Jews that had adopted Hellenism, that wanted to impose Hellenism on what we would call the Orthodox Jews today, okay? And it's one of the ironies of Jewish history that what was essentially a civil war, the Hellenistic Jews were actually supported by Antiochus because he shared their value system, but they're the ones that wanted it. So it's rather ironic that in North America, Hanukkah takes on this massive celebration of religious freedom when it's not, because when the, quote, Orthodox Jews, okay, won the war, they imposed orthodoxy on the Hellenistic Jews. So as I tell my students, you're celebrating the wrong holiday. You're going home tonight and you're celebrating the victory of orthodoxy over liberal Judaism. There's something wrong here. Okay? And we don't need to go into the social reasons why Hanukkah takes on this totally out of proportion holiday in terms of North American Jewry, but it does, and it's totally misunderstood. So going back, so that's the first war. Other than that, there were conflicts in Alexandria, which had 1 million Jews living there about the time of the BAYT Mikdash, between the Greek citizens and the Roman citizens. But other than that, the Jews were pretty much left alone in the ancient world. The real problem begins with Jesus, okay, with the birth of Christianity.
What about Homer? Nothing with.
Again, let's assume that I believe the story is true. Okay, it's an aberration story. Okay, it's not a normative story. not a story that takes place on a regular basis. Okay? And even there it's irrational. Okay? What's the basis? You have a nation that's different. In fact, that's ancient anti-Semitism. You have a nation whose laws and customs are different. We can't have them in our midst. Okay? The accusation is an accusation that's consistent with ancient anti-Semitism. But it's, like I said, there aren't that many. You only have one Haman story. You don't have dozens of Haman stories in the ancient world. You have a lot more, Jesus stories than you do, or Christian stories than you do ancient stories. After Jesus dies, his followers continue to practice Judaism. His followers live primarily in Judea, Eretz Yisrael. They consider themselves Jews, with the exception of two notions. One is that Jesus was resurrected. He was reborn after he died. And the other one is that he was Mashiach. Otherwise, his followers in Eretz Yisrael are mostly committed Jews. The separation comes about starting in about 50 CE, when a man named Paul, Shaul of Tarsus, in Christian terms Saint Paul, claims that he met Jesus, and that Jesus gave him orders to go and preach to the Gentiles. Now, there's a misconception. A lot of people have a popular notion that Paul, that the original followers of Christianity were Jewish, and not only that, but they were slaves. The reality is it's not true. The original followers of Paul, the ones that Paul preached to, were members of the upper class, the Roman upper class, who are labeled in history as fearers of the Lord. And these were people that had intellectually rejected paganism and had accepted ethical monotheism based largely on their observation and their connection with the Jews. Historians report that in the period, there's a period in Jewish history that's very quiet, but in that period, outside of the land of Israel, many non-Jews used to come to synagogue on Shabbat to hear sermons, and they were admired. They very admired many of their Jewish neighbors. They read the Torah in Greek, which was translated. It's called the Septuagint, which had been translated into Greek. They were attracted by the ideas. So they lived ethically monotheistic lives, just like Abraham. However, they couldn't convert fully to Judaism because it's a hard commitment to keep kosher, to get circumcised as an adult. So they lived ethically monotheistic lives. When Paul came along and showed them that there is a religion that is ethically monotheistic, without their having to keep kosher and circumcise and not have the same demands as Judaism has, this was a natural for them. The Roman historian Tacitus, who is not a friend of the Jews, states that 10% of the Roman Empire at the time of the first BAYT HaMikdash practiced some form of Judaism, including lighting candles at home. He says there's not a village in the Roman Empire where some people did not light candles on Friday night. So these were the people that became the first Christians. Now, some of you know that Onkelos, Tarim Onkelos, was a convert. He came from the royal family, and there are other members of the royal family, of the imperial family, that converted to Judaism. And for Christianity, Judaism was a competitor. So the question was, who would emerge as the winner, Judaism or Christianity? Judaism did not actually send people out to proselytize. However, by example, many non-Jews admired their Jewish neighbors. They saw the kind of lives that they led, and I'm wondering if we can say the same thing today. and they admired them, and they sought to emulate them to a certain degree. In order for Christianity to really succeed, it had to debunk Judaism. So the Christian Bible is full of attacks on Judaism and on Jews. The charge is that the Jews killed Jesus, and I can demonstrate logically that the story is false in its entirety. It's a libel, and that it was done to discredit the Jews and create hatred towards the Jews. The story goes like this. According to the Christian Bible, Jesus comes to the BAYT just before Passover, and as he enters, the crowds go, the multitudes, that's to use the Christian Bible's words, the multitudes scream, "Hosanna, Hosanna, the King is here." And then Jesus goes, turns over the money changers' tables, and then he goes for his Seder, and he gets arrested, and then he's brought in front of the court. And according to the Christian Bible, the court is held at night, where he's condemned to death, and he's turned over to the Romans, and the Roman emperor, the Roman procurator, that's the Roman governor, announces to the crowds that we have something called a Passover privilege, and that you can vote one person out of our jails. We have two people in our jails, Jesus and a man called Barabbas, who seems to have been a zealot. Zealots were those that fought against the Romans, believed that you need to use violence to eliminate the Romans, and to get the Romans out of the country. And the crowd goes in contemporary terms, Barabbas, 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 and Barabbas is freed, and Pontius Pilate goes and takes a glass of water, and he pours his water over his hands, and he says, it's not my sin, I wash my hands of this. And the Jews respond, let this sin be on the heads of us and our children forevermore. So that's the basic outline of the story. So here's the problem. First of all, why would Romans care if somebody turns over the money tables? Okay? The money changers were people who were necessary. People came from far and wide, including non-Jews. It's estimated by Paul Friedrichsen, who's a scholar of the period, historian of the period, that roughly 400,000 non-Jews a year came to the Beit HaMikdash. Because even though the people were polytheistic, why take a chance and ignore one other possible God? Also, there were many people who regarded Hashem as the chief God and all the other gods as, junior gods, so they wanted to cover their bets, and they would come to the Beit HaMikdash to bring sacrifice. I'm talking about from Egypt, from all over the Middle Eastern world. So money changes were necessary because you're not going to bring your cow with you from Turkey, okay? You bring money, and you bring your Turkish dinars, and you exchange them for shekels, and then you go out and you buy a cow. And of course, they made a little profit, okay? Number one. Number two, who says these people were rich, okay? And why would Jesus do it? What motivates him other than a built-in anti-money bias that exists in the Christian Bible, okay? Jesus is said to have said, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. So, this is an attitude towards money. Anyways, it goes to why would the Romans get involved? Okay, it's an issue between the office, the Sadducees, the high priest had his own people, and they could have dealt with it. Number two, it's not a death penalty. It's not a death penalty. No desecration. Okay, we know that the Talmud says that anybody that kills once every 70 years, all right, is a is a murderous court, hanging court. Also, Jewish courts don't meet at night, ever. Right? Jewish courts need to meet in the day, because the presumption is that at night the evidence won't be weighed properly because people are in a rush to get home to do whatever it is they get home. They're tired, they want to get it over with. So courts only meet in the daytime. That's a contradiction. Then no governor in his right mind would take a person So the other alternative is not he was accused of a religious crime. The reality, he was accused of a political crime. The multitudes called him Hosanna, Hosanna, the king is here. You can't recognize one person as king while the emperor is sitting in Rome. So it's a political crime. So why would the Jews get themselves involved? All right? So, and even if they did get themselves involved, how could Pontius Pilate be willing to free somebody that committed treason? It's not in his authority. Next thing is, there's no such thing in Roman history as a Passover privilege. It doesn't exist in Roman history. It's a made-up story in the Christian Bible to defame the Jews. Now, even if they did exist, so when the time came for the vote, why did they vote for Barabbas? If Jesus is recognized by multitudes as the king, and we're so happy he's here, okay, why would they vote against him? Barabbas is a minor guy. So the Christian Bible says, you know why? Because the agents of the high priest were going around persuading the Jewish people to vote for Barabbas. But wait, there's a problem for that. The average Jew hated the high priests because they were seen as collaborationists with the Romans. They wouldn't have influence. So the whole story falls apart. And that's the basis for Christian anti-Semitism. Christianity claims we killed their God. Nonsense. Makes no sense. The story is, if you examine it through a historical perspective, the story doesn't make sense. And the goal of the story, is to paint the Jews in very negative light. So what's the doctrine? The doctrine that comes out of the statement that the Jews are guilty, the Jews admit guilt, killing Jesus, the doctrine is called the doctrine of contempt. That's why Christians have a right to have doctrine of contempt. I always wonder if you're going to, when Christians and Jews have interfaith dialogues, and how do you eliminate anti-Semitism in people when that story is still there? And you can't eliminate that story because either the text is sacred or it's not sacred. So I don't know how to get around it. Okay, John Paul the 23rd said it doesn't apply to the Jews of our time, it applies to the Jews of their time. All right, not bad, but it's not exactly a very strong heter, okay? So this starts the beginning of what we call Christian anti-Semitism. And Christian anti-Semitism is going to make the claim, and Klein's theory is that the reason they hate us is because they want to be us, because Christians have a doctrine called supersessionism. The doctrine states that originally God chose the Jews, but the Jews were sinful people. We have evidence of this by the fact that they were put into exile, that their Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, and God shifted his favor to the new people, a new people called followers of Jesus, who are what they call Israel Veritas, true Israel, the true Jews. Paul says to be a Jew is not a matter of circumcision, it's a matter of the heart. Anybody can be a Jew in his terms, because you don't need to do mitzvot, you don't need to you don't need to have a brit milah, you don't have to have a Jewish mother. It's a matter of belief. And they believe that they have replaced us. And because they believe that they have replaced us, it's necessary to treat us with contempt. In the end of the 4th century, there were two very important clerics that would leave their mark on the history of anti-Semitism. One was a man called John Chrysostom. His nickname was the Golden Throat. He must have been a very compelling speaker. And John Chrysostom said that the way in which we have to deal with the Jews, we have to wipe them out. Okay? We have to get rid of them. On the other hand was a very famous church father by the name of, at that time he wasn't that famous, but who said, no, Jews should not be wiped out. Jews should be allowed to live. because they are witnesses to what happens to a people that rejects Jesus. And they always need to exist to show the rest, so they should be treated badly, they should be persecuted, but they shouldn't be killed because they need to live as living examples of what happens. And this is called the doctrine of witness. It's the doctrine of witness. It's Augustine's view that gets incorporated into church law by Gregory I. And Gregory I, basically the church's Catholic, Roman Catholic Church's official position on Jews is they're not to be killed. They're not to be forced to convert because it's an insincere conversion. However, if they did convert, that conversion is valid. You can't undo the conversion. And basically, that's the official position of the church. And that, although most of the, starting after 1096, most of the Catholics didn't, or Christians didn't listen to this, okay? It's just like, you have Jews whose leaders tell them to behave, not to disgrace, not to attack people on women on a bus, on a public bus. They don't listen. So in the same way, in the Catholic Church, you had the Pope said not, and everyone else said it was okay. We'll talk a little bit about blood libels, but I just want to demonstrate the point that the Church was opposed to this kind of stuff. Everyone knows blood libel is a story where matzahs, where Christians eat. Jews kill a Christian child in order to incorporate the matzah. 1143, Norwich, England.
In England.
You can count on the English. I would have preferred it to be French, but I think the English are much worse today than the French, anyways. Okay. See, in France, a lot of the anti-Semitism, I think, is for the Muslims. And it's Muslim-driven. In England, it's not only Muslim-driven. The English are glad to participate. As Conrad Black's wife, what's her name?
Barbara Emile.
Barbara Emile. And I'm going to be careful. Barbara Emile attended a party. This goes back to about 2001, talking about irrationalism. Okay, talk about irrationalism. And she reported at that party that the French ambassador to Britain said, "Why should the rest of the world be in jeopardy?" And I'm going to use a I'm going to use a lashon sagi nohar. I'm going to use a euphemism by this crappy little, because of one little crappy country. And when she reported it, everyone went crazy and they started yelling at Barbara Emile. Not at the ambassador for making a statement like that. Started yelling at Barbara Emile for daring to report a private conversation. Okay? You tell me if people are normal, okay, when it comes to Jews. Anyways, so the Jews, so the popes issued 23 bulls. That means 23 papal declarations against forbidding Christians to believe the story of the blood libel because the popes knew that Jews can't have blood. But no, so, I have to, in the name of, some honesty, what people have to understand that although the church is anti-Semitic, it wasn't necessarily murderous. Okay? And I'd rather live under a persecutor that's anti-Semitic than murderous. When we get to Nazism, okay, we will find basically a new kind of a new approach called eliminationist anti-Semitism, okay, which calls for the elimination of Jews, okay? But that's different, and I don't think it could have been, I don't think it could have occurred without centuries of groundwork of Jew hatred, okay? So no one's excused from this. I just want to point out that the church in its own, and the church has plenty to be, the church itself has plenty to account for, which it refuses to account for. The last pope, who was a pretty good guy, two popes ago, okay, John Paul? Yeah. He's a pretty good guy. Okay, he personally saved Jews when he was the messenger to Turkey, and he went around Poland afterwards saying, hey, you got to let the kids go. You got to, they got to be raised as Jews. You have no right to raise them as Christians. So on a personal level, he wasn't a bad guy. On the papal level, he said he couldn't bring himself to admit that the church made errors. He said it is true that people in the church made errors, but the church itself never could, because the church has to be inerrant. It's not such a far doctrine from what some people have in our world of Das Torah, okay? You can never be wrong, okay? There's always an explanation. But I think it requires us to understand that the central Catholic position against Jews is not eliminationist, okay? Questions?
The blood libel, they used to they would kill their own, or they would
they would kill a Christian child. All right, or a child would go missing, which was not unusual. All right, you're dealing here with a society of brutal peasants. You're dealing here with with a society where life has no significant value. Okay, and it's not necessarily that the child was originally killed in order to plan for this. Okay, a child goes missing, and right away the outcry comes out. Okay, and children must have gone missing all the time. They didn't have Amber Alerts. Right? They didn't have all. There were animals. People lived in the wilderness. Okay, cities. Like in Western, Norwich is a city, so Jews were blamed for it, okay? But next week, if God willing, if we get back to the subject of blood libels, I'll explain to you what the rationale is for blood libel. Did I talk about it last week? I know I spoke about it somewhere. So I'll show you how when the Christians read the Torah. And you have to understand, much of what the Christians say is based on Christians also have a midrash. We're not the only ones with midrash, okay? And they see the Torah and they read it differently than we do, okay? And just like we need support from the Torah for many of our ideas, for example, okay? Christianity believes that that faith is the single most important element of their religion, okay? So by Abraham, when Abraham says, "Bama Eda," how do I know that I'll inherit the land after God promises it to him? So the Torah tells us God takes him outside of the tent, and he says, "Habayt al Shemaim," look at the heavens and see, "Kach yizaracha," thus will be your children. And then the Torah says, "Vayamin b'Hashem vayachshav ala tzedakah." He believed in God and the Yachshav ala tzedakah, and he considered it righteous. So the way the text flows and the way we read it is that Abraham believed in God, all right, and Abraham believed that God was righteous. Okay, Christians read it. Abraham believed in God, and God considered that righteous, because they claim that the antecedent is not Abraham. Then later on in the book of Tzefania, which I have to tell you I haven't read, okay? I'm not going to pretend that I read Tzefania, all right? It's a very short book, but I've never gotten to it. It says, Tzadik be'emunasa yichye. A tzaddik lives by his faith. Bingo. That's at least two texts that I know of. There must be others. Right? So much of what they think, right, a lot of it has its roots in some form of Jewish ideas. In fact, this guy's book, this whole book is devoted to the notion, and I'll read you the inside cover. I mean, this book, there were two books that had huge buzz last year in the Jewish world. Three, sorry. One was Chazoni's The Philosophy of Hebrew Bible. One was Ruth. She's wonderful. She's in her 70s. It's much, but she would have been a candidate for me to marry. Okay, she's the head of the Yiddish department at Harvard University. She wrote a book called No Joke, which is about Jewish humor. Okay, and this book says a powerful history that shows anti-Judaism to be a mode of thought deeply embedded in the Western tradition. He says that David Nuremberg says we are dangerously complacent if we confine anti-Judaism to the margin of our culture. This complex of ideas sits at the core of Western tradition, which has operated for millennia as a means of making sense of the world. In other words, Jew hatred is the basis for making sense of the world. Last week, I read a what do you call it? I read a verse from what's the name? It was one-page thing. Where is it? Dummies that, what do you call it? From Jose Faurer. Every time I speak to somebody, and tell me I'm pronouncing it right. Dummies cannot dream. They resent the fact that others couldn't, rail with malice against those who dare. Desperately, they spend their lives trying to convince Adam that Eve is nothing more than a chimpanzee in fancy lingerie, to Eve that her beloved is a gorilla unworthy of any of the rabbi's blessings, that Israel, that they're not really Israel, or that they forged the law, or that nothing more, that is nothing more than an assortment of gibberish. To the nations that be still free from anarchy and might are better than God, paradise and Sinai, and to anyone who would lend them an ear that the rabbi's 7 blessings are an illusion. Thus countless people are, from godless pagans to heartless divines, are obsessed with a single goal, denying Israel the right to dream. And that's the whole name of the game, okay? And people don't even realize it. People don't even realize it, okay? And they come up with the most fantastical notions to support their arguments. Okay? That's it for tonight. Are there any questions? Be glad to answer anything. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it.
Last week, the term, I think it was about the crop, you used the word holistic.
What
does that mean?
Complete. Total. The holistic view means it's a multifaceted view. It's not just one aspect, okay?
Okay. And you mentioned the Jose Faurer. What, you said there's a couple of lectures. I found the site because of you. Which ones were you recommending?
The only one I read and understood was the one on the anti-Maimonidean controversy.
Oh.
Okay, the rest is like too heavy.
Between France and England this time?
No, between the Maimonides followers and between people that oppose the Rambam. Okay?
Okay, and what's the heading of it?
Anti-Maimonidean controversy.
You like that very much?
Listen, that's the only one I understood.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I'm reading his book. The last part of the book I understood. The first part of the book, I'm breaking my head. Okay?
But you like him as a...
I love him because he says things that no one dares to say, and he's honest, and it's true. What he says
so
is
anything
true.
thinks are probably...
Mordechai, the former chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, said, whatever Jose Faurer says is absolutely truth in the light of the Sephardic tradition that has been intact for thousands of years, unlike the Ashkenazic tradition, which has not been intact. And he's right. A friend of mine at Chat, Jeff Turtel, I asked him about it. He says, if you look at Ravadia Yosef, may he rest in pieces, halachic decisions, they're all based on precedent. Okay, and if you look at, and many of Ashkenazi halachic decisions are based on pilpul.